By the time you're hearing this, the federal government shutdown will have just hit 2 weeks. That's 2 weeks of furloughs, 2 weeks of essential workers like air traffic controllers doing their jobs without pay, 2 weeks of federally managed property like national parks closed, 2 weeks of politicians scrabbling for advantage. And let's be honest, the financial picture was looking pretty shaky here in Massachusetts before that even started. Think federal National Institutes of Health cuts, education grants slashed, fair housing grants either being pulled or simply not reviewed on their usual schedule. In very oversimplified terms, during funding negotiations, Democrats wanted to see pandemic-era healthcare tax credits be included in the annual funding measure, but Republicans were not on board, and without agreement or a stopgap funding bill, the government's spending authority expired on October 1st, and we spun into shutdown. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm talking with Mark Williams, finance lecturer at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. Mark has been keeping an eye on federal moves that could impact the Massachusetts economy, from policies as specific as calling halt on offshore wind projects or as sprawling as ramping up immigration enforcement and trying to redefine who gets to live in the U.S. and for how long. So we talked on Thursday, October 9th, when we were starting to get an early picture of how many workers could be affected here and what industries could feel that additional crunch. Since then, the White House budget chief announced that the threatened firings of thousands of federal workers mid-shutdown has indeed begun. So this includes staff at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Department of Treasury, who are deemed non-essential. After having just enough funding reserved to make it into October, even the Smithsonian Museums and the National Zoo are now closed. It also looked like, for the first time in recent history, active military members would miss a paycheck on the 15th. President Trump said on Saturday, though, that the Pentagon has, quote, identified funds to pay troops this week. There may be even more updates that I haven't gotten to there. For a shutdown, these effects do move fast. But for now, enjoy my conversation with Mark. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's start off with maybe the most helpful thing, which is explaining where we are physically at, where we are recording at this moment. So it is October 9th. We are in the middle of a federal shutdown at the moment. We do not know if, by the time listeners are hearing this on Tuesday, if the shutdown will have evolved, but that is where we are at now. So I guess my first question for you, Mark, would be, how are you looking at the kind of short-term impacts of the shutdown that we've seen so far?
Right, correct. And the shutdown itself is interesting because it's just a layer that creates additional uncertainty in the economic of the state of Massachusetts and then also the U.S. economy and globally. I mean, there is a reason why gold hit its all-time high yesterday, and today I see it's at another high, is because of distrust or uncertainty in the capital markets in the U.S. And as a result, this is a harbinger of the challenges. So a shutdown is an additional problem within our economy. That uncertainty itself has impact in regard to reduced GDP for the economy and also the number of employees being able to work and being paid. Employees don't get paid, they can't spend. If they can't spend, the economy doesn't grow. And if the economy doesn't grow, GDP shrinks. And then, of course, eventually we have a recession.
Right. So I think that's a great way to sort of get into this here, because on a fundamental level, we have a tremendous amount of federal employees right now, 750,000, who are not currently receiving their usual wages from the government. And so you're talking about that as not just that they aren't getting paid, but that it's also creating a blockage in what we would expect people to be doing in terms of their participation in the economy. So I'm understanding that correctly?
That's correct. And most economists are looking at this shutdown, and they've calculated that the cost to the U.S. economy is upward of $7 to $15 billion per week. So this is quite expensive. Some of that money will be returned to the economy, of course, when workers start working, getting paid again, and spending again. But until that happens, again, we have increased, Jennifer, uncertainty, which creates then less consumption and more question marks about, are we heading towards the precipice of a recession?
And of course, the context here, as you noted, is this is one layer on top of an entire cake I'm not sure exactly what the metaphor would be. That doesn't sound more optimistic than it is, but an array essentially of federal policies that are kind of piling on top of Massachusetts right now, specifically, and the country generally. So contextualize where Massachusetts was looking before the shutdown began.
Sure. I'm sure there's not anyone in the Healy administration that wouldn't love to hit the Wayback Machine and go back to 2024. GDP was growing nicely. Unemployment still was at a lower rate than the U.S. economy. And just within 6 months, it's flipped. Unemployment here in Massachusetts is now at 4.8% compared to the U.S. unemployment at 4.2%. GDP growth has slowed down, and it appears as if the U.S. economy is now growing at a faster clip than Massachusetts. And that's concerning.
And why is that concerning?
Well, in general, the reason why economists focus so much on GDP and growth is that when we think about any economy, whether a U.S. economy or a state economy like Massachusetts, when the GDP drops, then the standard of living for that country, or in this case, that state, drops. And that's concerning because as individuals feel that their net worth or their wealth is declining, they spend less. And in the US, 2/3 of GDP is driven by consumption. So if consumers such as you and I, if we're out of work or furloughed for a while, are not spending, then what that means, of course, is that the economy is not growing. So economists themselves like to see GDP growing. It's a sign of economic health. It's a financial wellness test, so to speak.
And where does trust enter into this? Because, of course, most people don't go into federal government service expecting to suddenly be not unemployed specifically, but unpaid for long periods of time without an end in sight, or maybe a lack of clarity about why the extended shutdown is happening. So how are you thinking about the kind of meta discourse around why we find ourselves in a shutdown, what that says to federal workers about what they can expect in terms of bringing in their paycheck and being able to spend and live their lives as usual?
Well, it used to be that you'd go into sort of a federal job. The pay wasn't that great, benefits were good, and the stress was low. And now it's the opposite. Pay isn't very good, it's not predictable, and it's quite risky to potentially lose your job without having any control over it.
Right. And how's that look inside Massachusetts? Is there anything about the federal workforce here that makes us either more vulnerable to the economic impacts of this sort of shutdown or better situated?
Well, Massachusetts is interesting. It's not Washington, D.C. It's not Maryland, the communities around the D.C. area, which are really hit hard by this furlough and the shutdown. In Massachusetts, we have roughly 4 million employees, those working. And the equivalent is roughly 40,000 either federal or military that are connected with our workforce. So that's roughly 1% of our workforce is impacted specifically by this. Now, what that means is we could see if, for example, this lasts for 1 month or so, that the shutdown could cost GDP growth for Massachusetts the equivalent of about $500 million. Now, you would argue, well, $500 million, our GDP is over 634 billion. What's $500 million among friends? But what this is, of course, is it's layering on. It's an incremental increase of not getting the economic growth that was anticipated and expected. So it's all of this, what we call uncertainty or risk in the economy now. When you add that up, Massachusetts is particularly vulnerable to the policies that are happening and have been instituted out of Washington, D.C.
And one last thing on sort of the plate setting side of it that I think is interesting to get into is that you have both the employment impacts, but then you also have all of these other slightly more attenuated parts of the Massachusetts economy. Our parks are shut down if they are federally managed. The question of whether or not there are delays at airports could mean more or less people end up being able to or interested in flying in and out of Logan and kind of participating in. I'm checking the calendar now. We're in October. It is peak Halloween season, Salem visiting season for us here in Massachusetts. So how do you think about those less direct impacts than what is going into one person's pocket, but the things that we tend to expect in terms of economic roll through, essentially, in Massachusetts.
Well, the number I was giving for the shutdown was $500 million each month that we have the shutdown for Massachusetts. And that sort of quantifies that risk. However, what you raised is a very good point. And that's the psychological cost. And that is of tourists feeling, hey, I'm not going to travel, or citizens saying I'm not going to spend as well. Those all have impact. We're not being able to go to a park, or the park service saying, if you're at the park and no one's around, please pick up the trash for us. All these actually have psychological impacts of trust and wondering, we pay taxes. Shouldn't the taxes go to keep our parks up, and shouldn't the parks be open when it's our weekend or holiday that we'd want to go visit? So all of this then comes together, I think, and paints a very negative picture.
And how have you interpreted the way that on the federal level and on the state level, politicians have been, or economists and politicians have been talking about the sort of proposition here that is being expressed to those taxpayers, that is being expressed to those federal employees, that this either is or is not a worthwhile trade-off?
Well, sure. The political process is very disappointing on the Republican and Democratic side. No one's really getting along, and the economics aren't really looked at. In essence, it seems like the political impact, as the politics around it, seem to be more important in driving these decisions more than what it's going to do to our economy. If the shutdown continues, and there's a good chance the last shutdown under the Trump administration lasted 30 days, if this lasts 2 months, 3 months, the economic impact is significant at the U.S. level and also at the state level. And it could be that final trigger that does push the U.S. economy, or eventually the Massachusetts economy, into recession. So, these are high stake games that the politicians are playing right now. And as a result, folks like ourselves in the academic world try to quantify these decisions so we can at least measure and try to predict and actually manage the potential risk that's coming down with these decisions.
So, one of the other reasons that we're talking today is even before the shutdown started, we were already looking at the impacts to Massachusetts of federal cuts across the board. We were looking at impacts of Medicaid cuts. We were considering losses of federal funding for higher educational institutions, changes to, for instance, the kinds of scientific research that are being funded. So, getting back to that initial, how were we doing even before the government shut down? Your recent analysis was painting a pretty bleak picture, at least on the surface.
Right. I did extensive analysis and research that was published back in April. And that looked at specifically, I called the trifecta. It was White House policies that were impacting NIH funding cuts and tariffs, and in particular, immigration crackdown. Across the U.S., Massachusetts in particular was mostly vulnerable to these. And the reason being is because we've had an economy which has been very stable. It's been driven by what we call the ed-med sector. So on the education side, higher education, we have more universities per capita than any other state. We're very proud of the research that comes out of these top universities, in particular, the amount of international students that come. This all generates economic might. And then on the med side, we have not only healthcare, but we have research, biotech, life sciences, and we're actually international leaders within life science industries. Many of the top global life science companies, biopharmas, are based here in Massachusetts. So this stable economy, at least we thought that these sectors, these pillars in our economy, were actually recession-proof. And add on top of it, Massachusetts has been a in a sense, a trade environment. We've traded with Canada and Mexico, and we've had these very strong, long-lasting relationships. All of this has been undermined by basically White House policy, in particular, NIH funding cuts hit our universities and research institutions. Tariffs themselves hit trading and also consumption and the cost of goods, so we're consuming less. And then finally, immigration crackdown is significant. Many people aren't aware, but Massachusetts has more residents that are immigrants, meaning first-generation immigrants, than even Texas as a percentage of its population. So we have 20% of our population, which is immigrants, 23% represent our workforce, And interestingly enough, 25% represent our entrepreneurs, which create new jobs and opportunities and a broader tax base for the state itself. So when you add the trifecta of these three policies together, and then you layer in what's happening with government shutdowns, and already the state has seen $3.6 billion in federal cuts of monies that were traditionally given to the Massachusetts on an annualized basis for making society and the economy stronger here in Massachusetts. When you add all these things together, then you have some concern.
And we're talking about April initially, but many of these policies have become even more heightened since then, right? So how has the picture shifted over the following months?
Right, and that's a good point. So the 3.6, what I refer to the 3.6 and $3.7 billion cuts in federal grants, that money itself is related to federal programs that were including actually Medicaid cuts, which are counted on Medicaid itself to meet the needs of our citizens in Massachusetts. All of those cuts started actually in January and February, and in particular after the July tax bill was passed. So these are new variables, again, that increase the likelihood of a economic slowdown for the state of Massachusetts.
And I am going to kind of dive in on the question or the phrasing of slowdown. Some of my colleagues have been reporting on the way that the state has been approaching the question of just how bad this will be and how soon and how able are we to weather it here in Massachusetts. And so the phrasing that they've landed on is essentially maybe we avoid a recession, maybe it's more of a slowdown. Your assessment puts it more likely to be in recession territory. Why is that?
Sure. After the new tax bill was passed, it included many cuts of budgetary things. And these are items in which the state of Massachusetts would be more inclined to actually cover than actually push the costs on to its customer base, its citizens. So I see it as a budget problem. On the revenue side in Massachusetts, tax revenue still comes in. If we have a financial crisis, the stock market declines in the next 6 months or so, we'll see tax revenue decline. I estimate tax revenues will decline next year by $1 billion. If you add that with 3.6, 3.7 billion in federal cuts, and you include a slowing GDP, then all of a sudden that adds together and you start seeing that not only is it a slowing economy, but if Massachusetts needs to cover its deficit, that is the funding gap that's not coming from the federal government, then it's going to have to enter into its rainy day fund, which currently, as you're aware, is around $8.5 billion. But that number can actually be depleted very quickly. We see these funding cuts multi-year. These cuts are not just once a year. And when you add all that up together, within 2.5 years, the rainy day fund that we have can be completely depleted. And if that were to occur without cost cutting, then Massachusetts is going to be forced to actually increase taxes or do other things, which will slow the economy down even further. So I see it now based on these new federal cuts that were just announced over the summer. This really pushes the probability and likelihood of a recession in Massachusetts up to be as soon as the third quarter or even the second quarter of 2026.
And so what does that look like on a practical level? It's often one of the tricks of the economist where it's sort of you have to find a way to talk about those high level ones and then what it actually feels like for the people who are experiencing it. There are entire generations of people who are entering a job market now who don't remember the 2008, 2009 feeling in the country. So what does recession or even slowdown because of these federal cuts look like practically for people who are just trying to live in Massachusetts?
Well, during the last big recession, what we call the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, Massachusetts actually lagged the U.S. economy. So the U.S. economy went into recession and Massachusetts followed. What I anticipate happening now is that Massachusetts is going to lead. And whenever Massachusetts leads a recession, meaning leads the U.S. into recession, job growth declines, of course, and then unemployment increases. And then after Massachusetts climbs out of the recession, it takes a while for jobs to come back. And that's the concern. And we're seeing that gap right now. It's very interesting, Jennifer. The U.S. unemployment rate's 4.3%, but we're already at 4.8. I anticipate we'll be at a 5% unemployment rate within the next 2 months. And in a recession, we could spike up to 6% or more. And so in essence, Massachusetts itself, as unemployment increases, consumption declines, tax revenues decline further, that's a downward spiral, which then will push the economy eventually into that recession. And GDP will decline as well. So it all sort of comes together in what we call a perfect storm. I hate to use that word, but it really is the trifecta. And one last element here is Massachusetts has relied so heavily on its immigrant population. 100% of its job growth over the last decade has been driven by immigrants coming. And that is, the inflow of immigrants is greater than the outflow of those moving to less expensive states. And now, with the immigrant crackdown, the flow of immigrants are declining, and what that has done is reduce the amount of job supply growth. And that's concerning long term. And we're seeing it if you want to get something done in your house. It's much harder to find labor now than it was even 6 months or a year ago.
And so thinking about those three pillars, the trifecta here, I assume there are levers that the Massachusetts legislature or the governor could be pulling that you'd like to see them pull?
Yes, I mean, there's really a proactive plan that needs to be done. Legislature right now, it seems to be less focused on what is coming and still playing politics. Yesterday, there was a veto that the governor had come out and said, hey, we've got to make some cost cutting because we know 2026 isn't going to look too bright. And the response by legislators are, no, we have these expenses we need to get. The current budget now was increased. That is, the 2026 budget was increased by 6%. And it's very clear that what's happening here in the economy is we're going to have a reduction in revenue. So we have to balance the budget. We can't just expect a rainy day fund to plug the hole. So as a result, really what needs to happen is a proactive approach, and that includes what I call basically a Massachusetts strong approach. And so that is that legislators get together. We actually work with the AG's office. We work with other blue states that are actually suing the White House for policies that are detrimental to these various states. This gives us much more power and punch in those situations. We also have to anticipate, and that is that one of our strengths in Massachusetts is our immigrant population. So we need to rally behind that and actually work on how we can get more STEM-related employees that can actually be here and help drive this knowledge-based economy that has made Massachusetts so strong for the last 2 decades and more. We haven't discussed HB1 funding cuts, which allow international students in particular and those coming from abroad to actually work at high-skilled labor jobs. This is detrimental to a knowledge-based economy like Massachusetts not having that labor supply. So there's many things that we could do to be more proactive, and clearly to be more fiscally responsible. We need to make cuts now in anticipation for what's coming in 2026 and 7 and 8. The White House policies aren't going away, and yet we need to plan for the fact of reduced revenues, reduced GDP, reduced jobs, reduced consumption in a slowing economy, and even possibly a recession.
Mark, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me about this.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks again to Mark Williams for joining me this week on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.